This is an exciting topic, and I know that we're going to have a full house, but at the moment we're still waiting on folks, but we're going to get started. Before we do, we have a special treat. We have the Provost, Nigma Sridhar. He's going to give us some words of welcome. So, Provost Sridhar.
Thank you, Dean Anglin, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you all for being here. This is, I would have said, oh, what a fantastic spring afternoon, but I suppose this is what counts for spring, right? But I hear it's going to be warmer later this week and all that stuff. But I think that's the frame for this conversation, right? I mean, what seems as just unpredictability and discomfort in weather is just deeply connected to the conversation that we're going to be having this afternoon as we think about these sustainable development goals, which really want to think broadly about what we are doing with our planet, what kinds of things matter as we think about sustainability and development. While we want to be doing interesting new things, we also want to be doing those interesting new things in a way that preserves what we have today for the long haul, right? And so I'm really excited for this conversation. But unfortunately, I have to, and I'll have to be honest and say this, I'm not going to be around for most of this conversation because we're searching for a dean for our business school, and I have interviews lined up. So I'm going to have to go and make those phone calls. But I'm really excited that you all are going to be here to talk about these goals. The most critical thing that I see for us and the leadership that the Levin College of Public Affairs and Education and the Maxine Goodman Levin School of Urban Affairs provides in this context of serving as a convener, serving as the place where these conversations occur, in seeing how these become real in our Cleveland context, right? I see our county executive just walked in. We have the city represented, which is the ultimate way of bringing local government as well as nonprofits and as well as the corporations to come together to see how we can all come to a common point where we can leverage these universal, comprehensive, and interconnected goals that we have set for ourselves as a society to be able to execute on those. So I just want to again say a warm welcome to you all. I wish you all an exciting conversation. Thank you very much to our panelists for taking the time to be here. And it's going to be an exciting afternoon. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Provost. My name is Roland Anglin, and I'm the Dean of the college here. And this is going to be an exciting afternoon of discussion about an important topic. I'm going to introduce the panel, but I'm going to do it in an abbreviated form. If you'd like more bios, we can provide that at the end of the meeting, but these are just a stellar set of individuals. First of all, I'm going to introduce Alexandra Heinecker. Alexandra? Alexandra is Director of Sustainability, the Sustainability Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. She's responsible for the university's program on sustainable development and sustainable development goals. And we welcome Ms. Heinecker. The next panelist that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Helen Bond, who is a university professor in the School of Education at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She is the former director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. She is also a Fulbright Nehru Fellow. Dr. Bond, welcome. The next individual is Sarah O'Keefe. She's Director of Sustainability and Climate Justice for the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in the City of Cleveland. She directs the Sustainability and Climate Justice initiatives and a staff of, as she says, passionate sustainability leaders. Welcome. We have Deepa Vidayas, who is a program manager for the neighborhoods and environment at the Cleveland Foundation. In her former role, she also served as sustainability manager at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability in Cleveland, Ohio. Our last panelist is David Carter, who is at the law school at Howard University, and he will talk a little bit about a very interesting initiative that Justin Hansford, he was supposed to be here, but he could not because of travel mishap, but Mr. Carter is going to fill in for us. Here's how we're going to conduct the panel. We're going to give each panelist about 5 minutes to talk about their part of the Sustainable Development Goals part of the world. And then we'll have a discussion, a collective discussion. Then we're going to invite you to get into this conversation. So why don't we start with Alexandra Heinecker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started on my work localizing the Sustainable Development Goals in various contexts, I thought it would be helpful to give a refresher on just what the Sustainable Development Goals are and how they came about. So back in 2015, world leaders gathered at the United Nations in New York and agreed to these 17 ambitious goals after 3 years of consultation with more than 1 million people around the world. These goals are remarkable because they represent an important shift in how we talk about sustainability, which goes beyond the environment to also include social and economic justice and absolutely must center equity. If it's not equitable, it's not sustainable. So the 17 goals were agreed to at the United Nations back in 2015 with the objective of achieving them by 2030. What most people don't realize is that there's a lot more underneath the ambitious 17 goals, including 169 targets and 232 indicators that help us think through what progress should look like and how we should measure it. This includes ways we can collect disaggregated data to measure progress across populations, which I believe my colleagues will go into more detail in their presentations to discuss. The thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, or global goals, is that they were agreed to by countries, but more than 60% of the work is implemented by local authorities. Now, the United Nations resolution recognizes the critical role that local authorities, academia, the private sector, and civil society play in achieving this goal, but they don't lay out how they should engage. So countries are invited every year to present a voluntary national review at the United Nations, reviewing their progress towards these goals, and every country has done so except for Haiti, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and the United States. So I wanted to share a few ways over the years that I have looked into localizing the Sustainable Development Goals in different contexts to provide some foundation for a conversation around how Cleveland might approach this topic. So before joining Carnegie Mellon University, I was the director of New York City's Sustainable Development Goals program at the Mayor's Office for International Affairs, where I was responsible for linking New York City's sustainability strategy to global conversations around sustainability using the framework of the global goals, which was a really important aspect of it. But like I mentioned, there was no concrete way for cities to engage in these conversations, and so I had spent many years working at the UN and recognized that the best way to do it would be to create a new acronym, the Voluntary Local Review. So countries have voluntary national reviews. I came up with the idea for cities to report through a process called voluntary local reviews. New York City became the first one in the world to do it, and now we have more than 330 localities around the world who have committed to doing their own reports. But what I want to emphasize is that it's different in every context. In the case of New York, we already had a sustainability strategy. It was mandated by City Council, and that included the recognition that equity was at the center of sustainability. But through the voluntary local review, where I looked at the range of the 17 goals and how different agencies beyond the ones recognized in the sustainability strategy were contributing to the goals, I identified a lot of gaps in areas where New York City colleagues were doing really important work, but it wasn't addressed as part of our sustainability strategy. So in 2019, when we started the next round of our strategizing, I was invited by the Mayor's Climate Office to be part of the working group to develop New York City's next sustainability strategy. And through the work I had done through the voluntary local review, brought in information from our colleagues working for the commissions on human rights, on gender equity, on cultural preservation, on consumer and worker protection, to ensure that their critical work was reflected in our overarching sustainability approach, including concrete goals, targets, and indicators. As I mentioned, we now have 330 plus voluntary local reviews around the world. In the US, this includes Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Orlando, and the state of Hawaii. In 2019, Provost Jim Garrett of Carnegie Mellon University announced that the university would be aligning its education, research, and practices to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I thought this was a really interesting opportunity to move beyond questions of operationally how we're addressing the goals, to expand to think about how we're educating people to achieve the goals, and how we're linking critical research that's happening at universities across the world to this really ambitious global agenda. So I joined Carnegie Mellon University in 2020. We conducted a voluntary university review looking at how the university's education, research, and practices were contributing to the goals. And starting from there, we began informing programming across the university with partners locally and globally to help make those connections, identify areas where we could work together more, and bring in different partners to help ensure that universities were part of this global conversation. The third way that I work to localize the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think this is really exciting and interesting for the Cleveland context because it's a similar approach, is through the Discover Network. And this is for Southwestern Pennsylvania. It was established by Sustainable Pittsburgh in 2020, and it's meant to bring together the broad range of sustainability efforts and many different partners who are working on the range of sustainable development goals across Southwestern Pennsylvania. And we don't just do it by writing up what we think it's going to be. It's been a process with a steering committee that includes universities, city officials, it includes county officials, it includes private sector representatives, and local nonprofits. We have 4 working groups that look at subsets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And over the past couple of years, we've brought together these groups to localize these broad, ambitious global objectives to the Southwestern Pennsylvania context and to identify the relevant partners who are actually working to address those goals. The first thing that we are doing is identifying how the targets are relevant to our context. The second one is we're collecting the data so we can start measuring what it is. The third is we're developing a narrative, a collective narrative for our region about how we're addressing these goals. And finally, we are looking to see how we can measure impact. I want to acknowledge that we have funding from the Pittsburgh Foundation. Foundations are critical to the work that we've been doing in the Pittsburgh region to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's my brief presentation, and I'd be so happy to talk about any of these things afterwards. Thank you.
I'd just like to say a hearty and warm welcome to all of you. What a pleasure it is to be back in an area that I was raised about 60 miles from here in Mansfield, Ohio. So I am a native of this community. I've been at Howard University for a number of years, but it's certainly wonderful to be back doing great work in this community. I want to bring greetings and welcome from Howard University in Washington, D.C. We're doing some interesting things around equity and the Sustainable Development Agenda. And so that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Our focus, my work, I'm also co-chair of SDSN. We have our resident director here with us today and my colleague Deepa Vivekas. We co-chair the Diversity and Equity and Justice for Sustainable Development committee at SDSN, working group rather. I want to start off with, we hear a lot of talk, just very briefly, and about what has informed our focus, which is centering equity. We hear a lot about the SDGs and that they're a common language for us to communicate. Their focus is on cities in terms of implementation. But my argument and my work is focused around development is not sustainable if it is not equitable. So we really need to center equity. You know, we talk about the people, prosperity, the planet, and partnerships are all very important. But we really need also something in there to also identify the fact that equity is really very important. And before I talk about some of the work that we've been doing at SDSN at Howard to really center equity, there is a part of the agenda that really does that, that's not being used as much. It's certainly an implementation tool, but it's also a way to think about it, and that's the leave no one behind principle. Now, we refer to that often as a principle. We often refer to that as a platitude, as a way of thinking about sustainable development, international development, and the SDGs, but it really lies at the heart of how we're supposed to actually approach it. So when we think about leave no one behind in that 2015 agenda, that means that equality, non-discrimination, the people that are the furthest behind should be served first, should be thought about and included in policies first. And meaning that those policies have to be disaggregated to the degree, you have to have data, that you can actually take that intersectional focus analysis to do that. So leave no one behind is going to be my informing principle of my conversation. 3 or 4 things that I want to refer to in my talk as we go forward, and that you can see up above is in the red, the U.S. failure to deliver a promise of racial equality. That's one of the signature pieces that SDSN produced. And this particular work has done something that no other document or no other work has really done. What we've done is to take a look at, and Justin Hansford's work sort of picks up off of this as well, is to look at the progress of certain racial and vulnerable minorities and measure their distance, their progress toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and sort of looking at the comparison to where the white majority is, for example, in breathing clean air, having access to clean water, having access to quality education, and then looking at the distance from that vulnerable minorities in terms of achieving the SDGs. Really shocking results. You'll hear more about that as we move forward on that. By the way, there's an interactive dashboard where you can go and look directly at Ohio to see Ohio's progress in terms of meeting. I actually have a slide or 2 on that I'll be able to show you, hopefully. So, but preceding that, Never More Urgent was also a research report where we looked at basically answering the question, how did we get here? What are the policies and the practices that have created a situation where you see in the red where most vulnerable minorities are nowhere near meeting the targets. Actually, states are only about 1/3 away from meeting the targets in general. And the distance between what's happening in minority communities is even further. And also, the last research paper that we did entitled Lessons from COVID-19, from Climate Change, what we can actually learn from crisis, from the pandemic, and how we can actually apply that to climate change, was really a signature piece of work where we looked at things like misinformation, behavior change, the disproportionate impact that crises and sustainable development, the lack of sustainable development is a crisis. We are going toward a crisis situation in terms of climate change. And we brought together, or SDSN, by the way, brought together, as well as Springer Nature, a very interdisciplinary pool of people to look at the current situation and to bring ideas from different people that you wouldn't think had a stake necessarily in this space, because we often think of sustainable development as climate change. And so we brought together a pool of people from all stakeholders and all actors, and we come up with some ideas around what we actually experienced during the pandemic and how that can be applied to a sustainable development context. In the red, the U.S. failure to deliver on a promise of racial equality. We found, first of all, when you take a look at some of the interactive maps, you'll see that And identifying in the red, the title means that significant challenges remain. And as a teacher, I used the nomenclature of A, B, C, D, E, F, and the United States pretty much received an F pretty much on many of the SDGs. But what you find here is you can see that we use racially disaggregated data where there was data available, and that's one of the major findings that I'll talk about a little bit more. In order to develop policies and practices here in Cleveland, Ohio, or elsewhere, you actually need to have data that's disaggregated to the degree that you can make policy toward an intersectional approach. For example, we did some work with the Poor People's Campaign looking at what was the, how did poor people fare during the pandemic and what we can learn about that for climate change as well, for the sustainable development. We took an intersectional approach looking at trying to understand how people experience poverty. Not all people experience poverty in the same way. Not all people experience the lack of sustainable development in the same way. Our biggest disparities in delivery was in education, employment, justice, and life expectancy. And that a dashboard and report is online for your viewing. I'm going to speed up just a little bit more here. This is what it looks like. And there's an interactive maps, there's state profiles, and you can actually download some of that data for your decision-making and policy analysis. This is one of the maps. It's an overall score of the United States. So if you were to ask the question, how are vulnerable minorities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, doing in terms of sustainable development, clean water, clean air, quality education, health and well-being, justice, partnerships? Red means significant challenges remain. You don't see green on the map. Green identifies that we're moving in the right direction. Our data shows that we are not. And again, if a significant part of your population is not developing, this is going to impact us all. And last of all, but not least, the last project that I'll be talking about that has informed my work here today, again, lessons from COVID-19 for climate change, i.e. for sustainable development, because all the goals work together. Climate change has an inequality aspect of that as well. 5 takeaways. I'll talk a little bit more in terms of collaboration across discipline and among diverse stakeholders. We found out that crises really require collaboration, bringing groups of people together. I think Deepa's done a fantastic job with that. Cleveland's doing a wonderful job with that. Hats off to the foundation, to the mayor, to CSU, and to others. Countering misinformation in terms of a crisis situation, in terms of sustainable development is really critical. Collective behavior change. We have forums, and we have one of the roles that education plays is certainly educating about sustainable development. At Howard, we're developing a new program. I'm leading that program. It's going to be a new master's degree focusing on anti-racism and education for sustainable development, because we see those things as really important so that we don't develop parts of society or we bake in the inequality that reports like in the red, Never More Urgent, and this overall report finds. We don't develop it in an uneven way so that happens. Last of all but not least, the disproportionate impact. What did we learn from bringing all the stakeholders together around this particular report, learning from COVID-19 for climate change? I don't think it's anything new. I think it's things that we already know, but the most vulnerable in our society is impacted the worst. And so I think that's the reason I constantly argue, I consistently say that we need to center people, we need to center anti-racism as we approach sustainable development. So looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Good. Did you get some sweets to get a little sugar in your system to go through this? And I'm looking forward to an active conversation. My name is Sarah O'Keefe. I know a number of you, Director of Sustainability and Climate Justice of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, for those of you who don't know me. I'm very excited to be here with my colleagues today and honored to be a part of this panel. I just want to restate or echo a couple of statements that Dr. Bond made about crises requiring collaboration and centering equity. Those are themes that are at the foundation of the work that we're doing in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. And just real quick bio on me, I am just 8 months in full-time at the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, but a longtime fan and collaborator of the office. And just going to talk a tiny bit about the work that we have been doing together, a lot of the folks in this room, and going forward on the SDGs. One reason I really wanted to join the Mayor's Office of Sustainability is to build upon the amazing work that has been done over the past decade in defining what is sustainability for the community and for the city of Cleveland. I think it's best captured in the Cleveland Climate Action Plan. You can see the areas of the Climate Action Plan here. Energy efficiency and green building, it's clean energy, it's sustainable transportation, it's clean water and vibrant green spaces, it's more local food and less waste, and it's the cross-cutting priorities of health, well-being, jobs, and equity. Here's our mayor standing in front of Mayor Bibb, standing in front of a home that is featuring solar panels. This is a low to moderate income home solar program that we collaborate with quite a few people on to bring green technology to low to moderate income homes, decrease energy burden, and to also provide access to green technology. This last picture is a longtime project of the city in partnership with the sewer district and others to advance stormwater management for residents. This is a rain barrel program. So this kind of definition of sustainability has been accomplished through extensive community building and engagement from a lot of the folks in this room and community-based organizations. It's resulted in a climate action plan and emissions reporting through the Carbon Disclosure Project. We have a sustainable Cleveland Municipal Action Plan and data collection that contributes to that wider climate action plan. We also have a clean and equitable energy future plan and a Lead for Cities designation of silver. That was work actually led by Deepa when she was in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and started to align with the Sustainable Development Goal areas. And then we have most recently a Circular Cleveland Roadmap that was unveiled last year in 2022. And I want to recognize our Senior Sustainability Manager of Circular Economy, Dr. Kathy Len, in our audience here, if you don't mind raising your hand, for her work on leading that for the city. And for, I think, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Divya Sridhar is also here. Thank you very much. That is basically we have our collaborative city supporting and enabling groups in place, and there are many other groups who have contributed to a lot of our important work. The plans that have come out of here, and I know a lot of you attended our summit, so this slides probably look a little familiar because these are the same themes that we want to emphasize over and over again. We have plans in place, we have collaborated, we are centering equity, we are absolutely collaborating in what I would call a crisis of climate change and a lot of other, you mentioned anti-racism. Racism as a public health crisis was declared by the city of Cleveland. I would say that climate change is the same. We haven't declared it yet, but we're getting there. On a global scale, this same question of what is sustainability, as you have heard, has been defined by the United Nations, and we are really at the point of just connecting our goals as a city. Alex talked about the voluntary local review, which I'm very interested in, and we may be exploring for the city of Cleveland. Right now, we're at the level of connecting our goals categorically to our goals of the Climate Action Plan and our various other plans that I mentioned to the Sustainable Development Goals in these different ways. I have them highlighted in pink here for our Climate Action Plan, Mayor Bibb's most pressing priorities, good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, and really, I'm sure a lot of you have heard him talk about tree canopy and planting trees, life on land. And also industry, innovation, infrastructure, responsible consumption and production really harkens back to the Circular Cleveland Roadmap. So we're already looking at SDGs, probably without even knowing it, right? And that's the same that goes for many organizations. We're already connected. It's a kind of language that we can all speak. And I think I'm a big fan of frameworks that connect over geographical boundaries. One thing that I think that Cleveland doesn't always recognize, but I always do because I used to live overseas and hear about it all the time, they would say, "Where are you from?" I lived in Japan. "Where are you from?" I would say, "Ohio." First of all, that means good morning in Japanese. And they always loved that. My children, I taught high school in English in high school. The other thing they would say is, "Oh, Godaiko," which is 5 Great Lakes. "You're sitting on 20% of the world's fresh water." And I was like, "Oh, I am. You're right." And that's something that I think we don't, if you've not been in that kind of context to think about it that way, you might not realize. We are an international city. We're sitting here. I think SDGs make sense for us to look at, not just for our organizations, for our city, for our region, but also for residents, and how do we talk about these in that context? They absolutely make sense when we talk about them to individuals as well. So while we have not intentionally mapped each one of these SDGs or the next level of indicators to our goals here in the city of Cleveland, they certainly do align, and I'm excited to learn more about the opportunities for toolkits that we might be looking at in the future. I also wanted to thank the Cleveland Foundation for having us work with, offering the opportunity to work with Sustainable Development Solutions Network that did data modeling on climate action planning, specifically through decarbonization pathways, which is what our summit was all about the other day on the 13th. And we'll have another review or a virtual debrief in about 4 to 6 weeks. You'll all be invited. And so that's one of the efforts that we're directly connected to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I look forward to our conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for giving your time with us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. To give a little bit, background, most of you are all, connected to Cleveland Foundation in some form. You've worked with us, you have engaged us as a thought partner, or you've engaged us as a trusted, colleague to engage in some of the amazing work that you're all involved in. But to give a little bit background about the SDG conversation itself, in December of 2022, in partnership with Philanthropy Ohio, we have John Guess here, and also we launched the SDG Learning Cohort for foundations in Ohio, with a focus on Northern Ohio community foundations. And thanks to the support from Mott Foundation, we also have a senior officer from Mott Foundation here. And during the very first convening at our cohort, we began by asking, what did the members of the cohort see as some of the challenges or the needs of their community that they're serving are. And these are exactly the words that they said. Our communities are in need of money, like alleviating poverty, food, healthcare, quality education, jobs, very important, democracy, housing, and having a safe community live in, and justice, reducing inequalities. And when we asked about, what did they think about the environmental factors, what they thought, that were important, and immediately they said reducing waste, clean water, environment, having an ecosystem health, or biodiversity was also mentioned by some, energy, clean air, and land. So again, what we did next was, as a table setting, we then took what we heard in the cohort and then saw how this fits together within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Essentially, what we learned is they were pretty much the same as mentioned in the SDGs. Again, the SDGs themselves, as Sarah and Helen and Alex mentioned, they're not a new domain of focus for us. Rather, it's an unfamiliar vocabulary to describe the work of the foundation or the work that we are already working on in the various area of impact. And again, as Helen mentioned, there was 1 million voices involved, and 88 countries were part of this framework development process. And that is what makes it a very robust, relatable, and a very well thought out, a thorough framework that allows us to kind of look at our work in a much deeper way. And again, the details lies not just in the 17 goals that are framed, it also lies in the targets. Essentially, because these are global goals, these targets are 169 targets are there, and 232 unique indicators are mentioned. And these targets are specifically how we define what success would look like for if it's an institution that is aligning with the SDGs. Every organization, we have our own organizational specific targets and strategies. So again, I would not be surprised if many of those are already aligned with SDGs. Again, having these targets allows us to look at what success would look like as an institution, as a local government, as a regional government. And indicators are also, again, data points, not just having the target. Having the indicator would allow us to assess, our progress. So that's when, cities like LA and Orlando, they're all using a collective way to display those by using dashboards. Dashboards are one way, and some cities are doing the VLR, which is a voluntary local review. Again, there are reports that are published, literally bringing all the efforts together that the city is doing collectively across all the 17 goals. The reason I show this nested SDG, to me, this connects more, because coming from a community development background, what I see in this framework is 4 of these 17 goals are directly to the environment, and 8 of the goals that you see in the middle are completely related to people and the society. And 4 of the other goals are completely related to the economic prosperity. And the one main, or the spine of this whole thing, is partnership for the goals. None of this can be accomplished without partnering and partnerships. And that's exactly how Cleveland Foundation also works. Without any of our partnership, we cannot really expect to move the needle. And regularly, on a regular basis, every 2 to 3 years, UNSDSN also publishes this report called SDG Cities Ranking Data. And that report essentially shows how are we doing as a region. Even though I said Cleveland, it's a little bit bigger, it's a regional data. So how are we doing as a region? From the SDG ranking report, it shows not just this area that we are struggling as a region, also the areas that we are doing well. So what you see here are the areas that we are facing major challenges, like especially the ones in red are really major challenge areas, and the ones that in orange are the significant challenges. And I can talk about the improvement that was made between the previous report to this report. In fact, in the previous report, pre-pandemic, we did not have good health and well-being in orange. It was in yellow in our region. Now it has entered orange after the pandemic. Again, affordable clean energy was in red. But again, with so many efforts around decarbonization and so many regional collective efforts around reducing our carbon footprint, we have made progress from red to orange. Again, with collective efforts, and again, Cleveland Foundation is just one entity. And we cannot essentially, achieve all the goals with the limited resources that we are able to invest in our community. It definitely takes a concerted and a very coordinated effort working in the same direction towards the area of these challenges, and make it part of our own work as to how we can all work towards a common agenda to help move all these areas that are in challenging areas towards making progress. And again, looking at 2022 data of where our grants have made an impact, 7 of these goals in the red and orange, were directly provided grant support from our foundation, even though we touched across 11 areas within the 17 goals. And when I say it is provided directly, there are always co-benefits or indirect alignments. What may be a grant towards energy does not always just touch on energy. It also affects health, so there is a benefit that touches on health and well-being. So again, this framework naturally, seamlessly captures the intersectionality very well. That is one of the other positives that we saw, during our alignment process. And again, this is an integrated approach example that Orlando, in example that was mentioned, one of the dashboards that was created by Orlando recently in 2021, to show what targets Orlando is planning to achieve as a region, because they not only work as a city of Orlando, they have included the county, and now they have the East Central region. They are working even as a larger region there now by integrating their targets and indicators. And with LA, this is one of their dashboards. They had almost 32 indicators reported just on good health and well-being for their region. And LA is unique in the sense because in 2028, there's going to be Olympics held in LA. So the city of LA is actually working in a much more accelerated manner to meet all these goals. So they are not only working, they're working in a very concerted efforts. And again, we were fortunate to have the Deputy Mayor of LA speak to us during one of our cohorts for the foundation, share about extensively her work on how they are coming together, how they are engaging universities, how they are engaging private sector, public sector, and how this framework allows them to do that to help enable achieve these goals. With that, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, or actually good afternoon. My name is David Carter. I'm a third-year law student at Howard University School of Law on behalf of Justin Hansford, who's a part of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. Our project actually focuses on, specifically with Dr. Bond's work and expanding on that to focus on how the UN 17 SDG goals are being realized in cities across the country, particularly amongst Black residents, and seeing how they're, faring to match up or meet up with the white majorities are able to indicate whether or not a city is doing enough of the work to try to realize the 17 SDG goals. This is a part of the Permanent Forum's work in trying to actually help realize the SDG goals and also the mandate that's provided to them to help lift up the issues of systemic injustices, racial injustices against communities of color, specifically Black communities and their descendants. I'm happy to talk more about our project in the Q&A, and especially tied into how some of the work that's being done here in Cleveland should be highlighted, emphasized, and more efforts should be done not only for collaborations among cities, but local partnerships among, non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, governmental actors, and the like, to make sure that we're truly realizing policies and laws that help really uplift everyone, and making sure that we're truly bringing ourselves to sustainable development for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carter, and thank you to the panel. I have a couple of questions before we turn to the audience participation. I wonder, anyone from the panel can answer this. Is the use of SDGs a movement, or is it a framework, or is it both?
I think it's a little bit of both, in that the official UN 2030 agenda offers us a framework about how we could actually develop not just our countries, but our localities in a more sustainable way. Because on the current track record, as the member states have realized it, is that if humanity kept on developing the way it would collapse on itself. In order to prevent that, we need to take steps that really address not just social issues and inequities that we all face as general countries, but also issues stemming from economic realities of various member states, environmental issues such as climate change, and injustices that in general keep pulling people backwards and allowing individuals, communities, countries to continue to propel forward while there's still people who are languishing in the background and being left behind and forgotten. But it's also a movement in that we collectively, intergenerationally, all try or want to make sure that we're leaving behind something that is better than what we found it or what we were brought into. And so it works in both ways, because we're trying to target a real issue that's going to keep festering if we don't actually try to identify where the problems are, what works, what needs to be improved on, what doesn't work and needs to actually be reformed. And going forward, how can we build something that's bigger than all of us to make sure that we all survive together?
Thank you. The SDGs have achieved a level of prominence internationally, and from your work, it's achieving some level of prominence in the United States. What messaging have you used to promote and forward the idea of SDG use in the United States?
One of the things I didn't speak about that we're doing at Howard that, of course, universities can do a lot about in terms of messaging. They can teach about education for sustainable development. They can be sustainable themselves and show that as a model. And they can also promote various programs. But I've often suggested to my students that If you were to be gathered in a global space or a room and to say, what is it that we need to sustain ourselves, to thrive, and to live, as a people, as a community, as a state, as a university? Well, we need water, we need clean air, we need access to justice, we need access to transportation, we need education, we need a measure of health and well-being. And so the message is, while we think about it and it's labeled as Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which were preceded by the Millennium Development Goals, and it's not something pre-imposed upon us by the United Nations. All member states got together and said, this is what we need as all human beings, regardless of race, tribe, ethnicity, gender. We need justice. We need fairness. We live on a planet, and we need the planet to be sustained. And so that's one way, I think, to message it. Of course, it's going to depend upon context, I think, Alex.
The one other thing I would also kind of, through the experience of working from the Community Development Corporation in the grassroots level, that I would say is the framework is really robust enough, especially for institutions. The SDG literacy is almost not required for the people in the community to actually have. As long as the institutions can use, these type of frameworks to clearly see where their work and their impact is going, I think it allows us to be almost being a bilingual myself. This framework allows us to be a bilingual in the space of work, because what the foundations are working could become easily it would be easier to communicate with businesses, with corporates, it could be easier to communicate with, institutions who are already aligning their, work with SDGs. So it also becomes easy moving on, when you're internationally beyond geography, communicating and messaging about our work. Because recently, last summer when I was in India, it almost took me 30 minutes to explain what community foundation is, because the concept of community foundation seems to be very much in the United States and the western part of the world, not so much in Asia. So again, it took me a while, and then also going into the 10 different program areas that we are working on and what we are working on. Again, this time when I go, I'm very sure that I can say that these are the goals that we are working on, and this is what percentage of the goals that we are targeting. And again, within education, I can clearly say these are the 3 targets that we are working on. The whole conversation of 30 minutes could now be 2 minutes. So again, there's an efficiency in terms of messaging beyond borders, and the clarity that one can bring through use of this framework is something that I have personally found the benefit in.
I think that's an excellent question and something I feel very passionate about. I have a confession to make, which is that I cannot believe I work on the Sustainable Development Goals, and I can't believe I'm here, because when they were being negotiated at the UN, I was like, oh my gosh, you people, I'm actually doing serious work on peace building and conflict resolution, and you're running around throwing up these silly icons, and I don't have time for this. Like, I gotta get things done. But then our previous president was elected, and my work kind of came to a standstill, and I was recognizing more and more the importance of local engagement. So I got the job at the mayor's office. And when I began to understand the targets and indicators and how this really was a lot deeper than those superficial 17 icons, I learned to appreciate the framework in a whole new way. But I still firmly believe that I will never go up to anyone in any community who's saying, I am suffering because I don't have access to clean water, I don't have access to good transportation, my education is poor. Did you know that in 2015, world leaders gathered at the United Nations and agreed to these 17 goals? No, they don't care about that, and I don't believe that every single person in this room needs to know what the Sustainable Development Goals is or to name each and every goal. I think they're a very useful framework, as Deepa and Dr. Bhan highlighted, to bring all of these concepts together on a higher level. But at the end of the day, what's really important is what we've all talked about, is that in our daily work, we're centering equity and making those links between economic, social, and environmental justice, and not that everyone can list every goal, target, and indicator.
I think one of the restraints has been in terms of communicating the SDGs, no matter what language, no matter how you define it, and I typically define it as what it is that you need to live and to thrive. Typically, people in the U.S. don't feel that the goals, no matter how you describe them, pertain to them. They see this as something that we do for people outside the United States. And so I think no matter how we deliver it, and it'll be different depending on your context, it's really important to show people to realize that, you know, when you look at, for example, some of the work that we did in the red, and you would think the SDG that says, you know, clean water, and part of that is to have adequate access to sanitation facilities, that's not an issue in the United States, when in fact in many vulnerable communities it is. So that's a real eye-opener to get people to see, because there's quite a bit of, I think, haughtiness and perhaps arrogance. The United States, you know, the notion of manifest destiny, we're, you know, the best and the brightest, when in fact, when you look at the most recent Sustainable Development Report, that the United States is not, it doesn't appear when you look at the SDG goals and when you really get down to the targets and indicators, we are not at this functioning at the same level on these basic goals as other developed countries. And I think that is an eye-opener when people will even accept that and believe that. And you really have to show them the evidence for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just one comment, as very much a newcomer to the SDGs, and I'm very much at the level of the 17 icons, with a few deeper on climate action. But as someone who came from a very small town that was, after having traveled overseas in high school and come back, and I was like, ooh, this is a whole different mindset. Reverse culture shock is a real thing, especially if you are in a tiny town and then you go when you're 16 overseas and you come back and you try to readjust to high school after having lived by yourself in a foreign country. And I think that but what I appreciate about the SDGs is that they don't shy away from, so I had personal experience of that haughtiness that you're talking about, of somebody saying, oh, well, that's over there, it doesn't pertain to me, it doesn't pertain to my small community. And I think what the SDGs don't shy away from is saying that we can use resources. It's not saying we don't use resources, it's saying that we use resources fairly, equitably, and make sure that everyone has access and equal access. And I think everyone in my little town could get behind that. And I think communication of these kind of goals is very important, and not getting down to the nitty-gritty of the indicator level. But so I appreciate the connection, and they can be used in small communities, in rural counties as well.
You've convinced me that you have a message. Now tell me about a strategy. We have folks in the room who command networks of community-based organizations and the like. How do you connect with those networks? Is there a strategy for doing so across the country?
Because this framework allows us to do a peer-to-peer comparison, I have seen a couple of best practices, and I've talked to people who have kind of done these best practices. One is LA is a great example, and Orlando, you know, East Central region is a phenomenal example. And again, you know, there is one more example in Florida around Fort Myers, which is collaboratory. So again, the way they have worked is they have used the framework very well, but they don't really talk in terms of the SDG language, in terms of the numbering of the frameworks. But again, every institution, like, you know, the foundation has, you know, aligned all their work around the SDGs. We have seen the city of Orlando has actually not just done the lead for cities, but they've also done the voluntary local review. They have aligned all their programmatic efforts, everything that's going on within the city, to the SDGs. And same with the case with the county. So again, they have this incrementally, they've kept on adding and kept on bringing more partners together in the work. So again, now they have solid definition for their targets, what success could look like in each and every area. So now collectively they are working towards those goals. And collaboratively, again, they now have 80 plus partners who they have brought together at the table. They have ongoing meetings that they have just to look at those and how they can address each and every problem areas, and how they can collectively bring the partners from all different sectors together. So they have ongoing meetings, because Collaboratory has also set a robust target, the Fort Myers region, very similar to Los Angeles with achieving all these goals by 2028. So they're working in such a rapid pace, and we have those brilliant examples right here in the US to bring those kind of collective collaboration, because we are all working in these spaces and we all have a separate focus areas. If only we can kind of see how we can come together in a common way through defining our targets and indicators, I think that would be one way I could think of success.
Brilliant. I like the idea of a collaboratory. Well, it's now time for the audience to get involved and to ask your questions. So I'm opening it up. Do you have questions?
If I could ask two questions. One, I'll ask a question that kind of, I'll pretend I'm a banker. I know I maybe might look like, all older white guy kind of thing. Which is this. Often, those type of people will think in terms of all this stuff, does it save any money? Okay, so I'm wondering, even though I think as a world we put too much attention on economic indicators, on things like GDP rather than like a happiness index or something of that nature, but I'm wondering if that could build also some momentum for a movement if there are examples of actual economic efficiency, and if you have particularly something on a local level that says, because we use this framework that help put things together, we're actually doing better from an economy standpoint. So that's the first question. The second question is, it's embarrassing to me as an American that one of the 5 countries that has not done a voluntary national review is the United States. And unfortunately, we can't just blame the previous administration for it. I'm wondering if you think, is there anything that can be done by those of you who are working on localization or SDGs on a local level to encourage our national government to engage on the SDGs? And if they would do so, will that make any difference?
That's a very loaded question. Both questions are very loaded. But I'll try to take a stab at the first one, in that I think that having data from these cities, localities, helps with showing us the economic track record on how these are benefiting the local economies that they're in. And that's also a good practice for public policy in general. You should not be creating, economic projects, economic policy, social policy without trying to see where the tangible results and expecting that it ultimately solves the problem. You have to show that there is a trajectory that this now displays, whether it's indicating that it's actually helping solve the problem or it's not quite hitting there and more tweaks need to be made. That also brings up the conversation about focusing on disaggregated data that specifically highlights, what is the impact along not just racial groups, but gender groups, all, groups and groups that intersect in order to see where truly the policy is actually affecting and where improvements need to be made to make sure that everybody is actually getting the benefit of the solution. I would also say more tangibly when it comes to like investing in, climate plus or climate beneficial, policies, you do see market results and what is actually helping cities save costs from, converting themselves from more environmentally harmful, policies or track records to more environmentally friendly, what is actually working to help improve communities and quality of life. It's not always going to be just, a happy index as you indicated, but really hard line, like what are the economic benefits to this and how can the city, locality, or state continue to justify that? To your second question, I think that when it comes to partnerships amongst, localities, it shouldn't necessarily just be with non-governmental organizations. It should be a bottom-up approach starting from local levels, moving to regional levels, statewide, and then federally, how are we all building out policies that actually help target those goals? And I think one of our panelists actually mentioned that 60% of the legwork for the 17 SDG goals is mostly done locally, and the target goals and the indicators from that are all effectively measured at the local level. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government should stay out of the process entirely. There's still a lot of tools and resources that the federal government can offer to local governments in order to help better invest into these policy programs and actually help cities better effectuate their policies, one. And two, what are the data sets that they can rely on? The LA voluntary review actually is a great example because they mostly rely on statistics that are provided to them from the US Census Bureau. Other cities rely on federal agencies to kind of give them a bigger picture of what they're looking at as a city as a whole and how they could break that down from there. But a lot of the work that nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations can offer is also beneficial to help solving the problem. So I hope that gets it.
Can I just jump in on the economic side of things real quick? Because I think that this is one of my favorite discussion points with my father about how do we measure a good economy, right? Is it GDP? Is it happiness index? Is there somewhere in between? We know that GDP does not capture the externalities that we are now facing as a local government to repair millions and millions of dollars a year for lead service line replacement. We are for lead remediation, and that is something that I believe the SDGs, again, newcomer here, but a framework like this that has been very carefully wrought with a lot of input offers us the opportunity to avoid a lot of those externalities and avoid those costs. So that would be my answer to bankers who are interested in saving money.
I can add, a couple of just a quick data point where since 2021 to 2022, the corporate giving, social giving, has increased by close to 25%, and many of the corporates, have their giving aligned to reduced inequalities around the SDGs, specifically around SDG 10. If only we as community foundations are able to kind of speak and align to their language, show that we are doing the work in the grassroots level, and if we can bring those connections and tie those in, I think if there is a way for us to do that better, and if this framework could help, that could be one option. And to answer your second question, because this is a mid-year mark of the 2030 agenda, so this year with the United Nations General Assembly happening in September, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pressure on the US when that's in 140 plus countries are going to be in New York, to expect for the president to say something about, what US is going to do about this. And if the president commits to do a VNR, then there's going to be a significant momentum that could come up across the country. And if that comes up, and when that comes up, we are already ahead of the curve. So again, as a Northeast Ohio region.
Just something very, very quickly. Nick, you mentioned, I think, one of your initial questions was, how can, if we use this common language, this common framework, how can it increase efficiency in terms of finance and otherwise? I'd like to reframe that question. How can reducing poverty, reducing hunger, increasing access to education, health, well-being, equal access to justice, can you put a price tag on that? How can making sure that, the planet survives? So, and we do need financing for the SDGs. Jeff Sachs is great in terms of working globally around that. But it's not just using a common, I think it's important to have a common language and a common framework, absolutely, because we're all interconnected. In fact, spillovers from the United States disproportionately impact, emerging countries. That's part of what we learned from the crisis. But it's not if we use this language, if we have this framework, we cannot continue to exist without implementing, whether you call them the goals, one of our colleagues that was on your SDG learning format from Africa, Judith, who talks about, her work in Africa, and that in the next 20 or 30 years, 40, 50 years, 1 out of every 5 persons on the planet will be African. What happens in Africa is going to affect us here. So the question is, we don't have a choice whether we pursue the Sustainable Development Goals, if they're renamed, reframed, recommunicated, excommunicated. This is what we need to survive as a human race.
Other questions?
I just want to respond to your second point because I raised it. That the United States is one of the 5 countries who hasn't submitted a voluntary national review, and I am in no small part unaware that the reason that when I came up with the idea of the voluntary local review for New York City, the reason that it was so well received is because we were absent on the international stage. So working for the New York City Mayor's Office of International Affairs at a time when our federal government stepped back from all international engagements gave us an opportunity to really underscore the critical role that cities play in achieving this ambitious global agenda. At the same time, I was concerned that if we focus too much on saying cities are doing all of it, when the next administration came in, they'd say, oh, cities don't matter anymore. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, it's because the federal government hasn't really stepped up and committed to doing a voluntary national review. My personal opinion is it's not my priority number one priority to advocate for the federal government to do that. I'm more interested in what's happening at the local level and how we can all learn together, and then do that bottom-up approach so that the federal government will be in a position where they can conduct a voluntary national review. Because something that's also really important to acknowledge is that in the United States, we're set up differently than most other countries. Cities fundraise for themselves. It really is cities who are responsible for doing all of this. So our relationship to the federal government is different than, say, Kenya, where the federal government and every county align their policies and practices. So it makes much more sense for them to do this aligning. And I think tons of cities have adopted the voluntary local review so that they contribute to their national processes. So I do hope that the US will do it because it sends an important signal, but the most important work, I always believe happens at the local level, so.
When I think about the goals, poverty, structural racism, climate, community, those are things that we have been talking about for decades, centuries, right? 30 years ago, Reagan administration, Margaret Heckler, the social determinants of health, was the identification of the 5 health disparities that still impact us today. And those health disparities are intimately tied to the environment. And you mentioned lead, those types of things. So, I see our county executive here, I see representation from the mayor's office and just other organizations. What one or two things could you offer up to us as a community, the Cleveland Foundation is in the room, that we collectively in this room could come together as a think tank and say, you know what, we can put our arms around this in a community that is poverty stricken and invest in it for 3 years to see what the outcomes are so that we can get to the financial impact. Because in my experience, in order to get the business community, corporate, involved in this conversation, when you're talking about the social terms of health, you have to tie it to the bottom line. And so, what 1 or 2 ideas could you share with us that we could do over and perhaps come together, in the coming weeks to say, we are going to take, Clark Fulton, and we're going to have an intentional effort at doing X to see what the outcomes are monitored in 12-month increments.
So may I ask you? Hang on. May I ask your name and your affiliation, if you don't mind?
Sure. I'm Dr. Natoya Walker-Minor. I am Deputy General Manager of the Regional Transit Authority. Spent a combined total of 20 years in the city of Cleveland, probably 8 years at CMHA. I've worked in poverty areas my entire life, dedicated, like so many others in the room that I see, including Randy over there, Chris, County Executive. And so when we think about these things, I've done a 30-year career, and I'm still dealing with the same types of challenges. And so I immediately think, land use. How do we tie land use? Should we say every 3 miles where development is occurring, there should be a park so that we improve air quality? Things that county executive can take back, and we tie that to transit-oriented development, or we take that back to the city of Cleveland, and then the foundations that are in the room and their peers, the we concentrate those efforts at making intentional efforts at creating green space so kids have a safe place to play, to read in so they can see things. I mean, you all probably remember, broken glass window. It's true. Wilson wrote that 30 years ago. So it's still true today. And so as I think about land use and zoning and environmental quality, those are things that quickly come to my mind, but it takes a public-private, philanthropic partnership so that you can drive those three things to an outcome.
So just taking the first stab at that, there are a lot of things in the works at the moment that I feel like Greater Cleveland RTA is in the room when we talk about 15-minute cities, for example, and thinking about walk sheds. And then we have ARPA dollars dedicated to the remediation of brownfields and the assembly of parcels to attract investment from cleaner manufacturing than historic manufacturers. These are things that will improve and address the broken window syndrome in some places, but the city is absolutely partnering, I will say collaborating across multi-government bodies. We talk on a regular basis with the county, with philanthropic organizations to pursue exactly what you're talking about in many different ways. I see Tim Deem in the audience here and have met him through the Cleve Lot Foundation and the use of vacant lands and the creation of a tool that will help us evaluate those. How do we use vacant land in many different ways, from residential use to developer use to, and it's an incredible collaborative room that they've been able to set up through a grant from the US EPA, correct, with Western Reserve Land Conservancy. So I think there are a number of opportunities to get involved in a lot of those, and I will just sit back to, I know that Alex had something that she wanted to say as well.
Well, first of all, I think transportation is the most important issue in sustainability, so I'm so thrilled that you're here and thinking about this for all the reasons that you mentioned. And even though there's no specific goal that talks about transportation is addressed in a lot of those targets, and I think that's more important, that we think about how it's related to all of these other goals. But you're asking for concrete suggestions. I don't know anything about Cleveland other than what I've learned from Deepa, but I can tell you in my experience working with a lot of other contexts, what's really helpful is, first of all, to recognize what's already happening across sectors using this framework. And that's what we've been doing in what I mentioned in southwestern Pennsylvania, is bringing together everyone. Everybody knows each other. They kind of know that people are working on things. They're kind of aware of things. But using this framework as a way to organize and discuss what everyone is doing and how they're measuring it, I don't know if it's possible to literally see light bulbs go off over people's heads, but when people start talking about how their work, let's say, I just want to sit down with you and map what your transit agency is doing to these goals. Talking about it using this and then finding those links with other parts of the cities to see how you can work together, I think is a new way to talk about old problems. And I also really appreciate that the Sustainable Development Goals are used by so many different partners. So something that Erin, who's now the Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for Los Angeles, she and I work together closely. And in addition to these formal relationships that we talk about, if somebody in my city in New York came to me with a question about a specific topic, I'm going to call Erin and ask her how Los Angeles is addressing it and how she's mapped it to the goals, and which parts of her city may have solutions to what we're trying to think through in New York. So there's all these rankings and discussions of targets and indicators, which I've said are really important. But I think talking about these policy issues on a policy level, talking about what we measure and why it's important, not just coming up with the numbers, is a really important conversation to have, to think about how to get to what we want to achieve by 2030.
That's such a important point raised by you, Alex, and also thank you so much, Natoya, for coming and also for the question. I'm going to wear my community development professional hat here. If I were working in a neighborhood like Buckeye, where I have experience working, and what does it truly mean to actually localize this goal? So in my mind, having shown that SDG 3, for example, which is good health and well-being, was never in the significant challenge area for our region. Again, there are 9 different goals that are in significant, major and significant challenges. And the good health and well-being entered only in the newer report post-pandemic as a challenge area in our region. So that being the case, we are still not too far, before it hitting into the red or the major challenge area to actually get it out of the area and actually make progress. So what can we do, thinking that that is a newer area of challenge that has entered? So again, there are so many corporates, who have corporate voluntary experience. Every year they give voluntary hours, and institutions have their voluntary program. Can we all have a concerted effort to decide that this year all our voluntary program is going to be focused on good health and well-being, and these are the indicators that we are going to be working on as a region to collectively address in the southeast side neighborhood? And can we see the progress? And again, having done the Lead for Cities ranking for the city, and silver rated, a city, what I've noticed is, while we were always talked about as the most segregated city in the country and biggest poor city in America, one thing that we failed to talk about is we have had 48.5 million voluntary hours given to the city by the people in the community. We ranked 28th in the country for the number of voluntary hours, and also we also have given people in the community 55% and over, people have donated $25 or more towards charity, which means that we may be the biggest poor city, but we are also the biggest generous poor city in America. So we have a significant amount of social connectedness in the city that is already there. Can we leverage that? Can we leverage the charitable mindset that we have in the city? Can we come together saying that this is the area we are going to address as a region, and these are our priorities? Let's focus on these place-based efforts around these. And that's just one example that I had to think through now. But again, with all your collective minds, we can come up with such, many more examples, and how we can tangibly translate that to the community.
I want to ask Rendell McShepard to talk a little bit about his own efforts to do collective impact here in Cleveland, because I think it relates, unless I'm wrong, Rendell.
My name is Rendell McShepard. Among my proudest achievements, Dr. Minor's high school classmate. But I'm a chairman and co-founder of a think tank called Policy Bridge. We wrote a research report titled Resetting the Table, and we basically make the case for the argument that part of the problem as we see it is that so many institutions, organizations, governmental entities, et cetera, are all sort of declaring victory for whatever, we can even say SDGs in their respective space. However, when you back up and look at how the city is doing as a whole, we know the statistics are pretty abysmal. So we believe that the way to address this problem is to challenge, and I commend our county executive because he's actually attended these meetings among many others, to challenge our leadership throughout the city to agree to collective impact approach and to setting success measures that we can all agree upon. Because if we all define success differently and we're all running major organizations, institutions, corporations, we'll never get to where we want to or need to be, right? So it's a tall order, and Dean Anglin has been very helpful in walking with us along this journey. But I guess I've been thinking about that a little bit as I've listened, and the big question for me is, does everyone understand, as Dr. Bond said, that we all either rise or fall based on how we view this work, right? The very first report that our think tank did was called, I can't remember it, but it was focused on African American males. And we basically said it wasn't a moral lament, it was an economic imperative that we do something about African American men, because people would kind of throw their hands up and say, it's just another, a cry for social help. Well, no, we were making the case, as you were, that regions can't move forward if you leave subsets of the community behind. So, but the question is, do corporations understand that they have a role to play in climate change? Yes, now they are because of ESG, but there's a lot of pushback from corporations now on ESG. Or, all the things that are on the list they're all, important, but I just always wonder, do all the actors that need to be a part of this understand and embrace the idea of holding hands and sort of taking this walk together? So Untapped Potential was the name of that first report that I was referencing, so you get the point. But yes, we are trying this approach. We have had some success in getting people to come to the table to sort of talk this through, but it is extremely difficult to call meetings like this when you get mayors and county executives and foundation presidents and heads of large, nonprofit institutions and universities, and all of them need to be at the table to offer a perspective. So, but we are fighting hard to make it happen, and we'll keep you all posted, and hopefully that speaks to
It does.
maybe a bit more than you asked for.
No, it does. But I also want to lift up your reliance on data and trying to get at empirical measures of progress. And that's commendable. I think that's the basis of what all of us are trying to do with SDGs and the collective impact model. Yes, Grace Galucci.
Grace Galucci, I'm Executive Director of NOACA, which is the NPO for Greater Cleveland. My question, I'll get to in a second, but I did want to address economics, having taught economics and finance, particularly transportation economics and finance for 25 years at various schools, including this one. Yes, every social ill impacts GDP, can be quantified, and has been, and particularly relative to climate change. I will draw your attention to a report that was recently released by Swiss Re, a European insurance company, that has quantified the impacts of climate change, such as natural disasters. What is the cost and to whom? And as economics, we always talk about who benefits and who pays and who benefits. So there is, I think, a very strong case to make to companies about ways that they are able to contribute to a higher GDP, or at worst, not impact the GDP by taking on climate change issues. But my question is, thank you all very much, first of all, for being here and introducing some of the discussion around the 17, I want to say, what you're calling them SDGs?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
SDGs. So those are national or international, and I appreciate the connection to the United Nations. It makes me wonder how much more difficult is it, or has there been any discussion about how much more difficult those are in the United States as opposed to the rest of the world, considering how much more diverse we are racially, economically, in terms of rural and urban. I've got 5 counties that we are working on developing a climate action plan for, and that's extremely challenging. But looking at the U.S. to the world, I wonder if there's been that thought. If you look at just our 2 other largest countries in the world, China and India, very different countries than the United States, our problems are very, very different. And so when we talk about achieving those 17 goals, what does it look like for them versus us, or versus Italy, or versus whomever, and how, has there been discussion on that?
Okay, well,
Yeah.
hello, I'm a latecomer. My name is Justin Hansford. I'm a law professor at Howard University, where David has been working for the last 3 years, about to graduate from. I hope you enjoyed his presentation, and I apologize for being late. I just wanted to say how excited I am that this conversation is happening, how sorry I am that my flight delays kept me from being here during the beginning. But to answer your question, that is really the crux of the issue. Some people would argue, of course, that with the strongest economic superpower in the world, we should have the easiest pathway towards reaching all of the Sustainable Development Goals here in the United States. But the diversity of our community is part of the story that is the untold part of the story, where unfortunately we have seen
that the development is unequal. And so it becomes more challenging in that environment. And I think that's one of the interesting things that, I know Professor Bond has also perhaps talked about, the uneven development, and perhaps that's the challenge. The challenge is for us to make sure that the development happens in a way that's equitable along the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we've found is in the cities that we've gone to is that oftentimes we haven't even begun, and I'm sure David has talked about this, we haven't begun to measure how the inequities actually are playing out in a very precise way. It's just a guess. And we have a overall score that is given to a state or a city which may have a huge imbalance. So we just came from San Francisco, which was a 35 on the 100 scale, which isn't great, but still is the number 13th ranked state in the United States. But in terms of something like income, that is a place where there are, I think, about 800,000 residents. And so I'm thinking about the city of San Francisco, 800,000 residents in the city of San Francisco, 300,000 millionaires live in the city of San Francisco. While there's a huge homelessness crisis, not quite on the level of Los Angeles, but also in San Francisco, there's a homelessness crisis, right? So that's a place where if you were to look at the SDGs that talked about economics and income, the overall score for San Francisco may be strong. But if you looked at it closer and took notice of the inequity in the development that's happening there, we have a population that was 13% African American 15 years ago. Now it's 4% African American. There's been a huge push to move people out of historically African American neighborhoods in San Francisco, like the Fillmore district. So these are the types of stories that are untold stories that I think that we still need to delve deeper into to have a full picture of what's happening in our cities.
Can I just add to that in that, yes, the SDG goals, the agenda is difficult, but that's because of the fact that the problem that we face is so huge, and that every country faces the problems differently because they have different circumstances. Obviously, you would not assume that Iraq has the same issues as the United States, but the same would go for here, and that also kind of stresses the importance of which of the 17 goals are, actually attainable for us to try to achieve based on what we have, what we can actually achieve, and which are priority based off of the issues that we face. So like issues that are important that the city of Los Angeles could address are different from issues of importance and issues that the city of Cleveland can actually try to address. And that's different because of the environment that they're both residing in, the population sizes, diversity. All those factors come into play into why certain SDGs are prioritized over others. But I think also what's illuminating about the SDG goals and the agenda is how it constantly invokes all of us to be making hard conversation or having hard conversations about the histories of our communities, what has caused some of the inequities that we've seen in our communities, and how can we move forward? How can we address those wrongs and also try to build out policies that address it moving forward? I actually love one of the questions, or both questions that were asked here, that really sought to try to address some of the systemic issues that Black Clevelanders deal with on a daily basis that predate the UN trying to grapple with the issue of sustainably developing human civilization for the next generation onward, that communities of color across the country, specific even here to Cleveland, have been trying to deal with 30 years ago, or even well before that. And that's important to the conversation, and we should not forget that. Well, we're all here, we're all local leaders, we're all community leaders of our communities, that we also need to have more community input in these conversations, and that we cannot neglect the fact that while we can continue to think of all of the great policy ideas of our generation, of our time, to try to address this, if the community is not involved, if they're not listening, if they're not seeing what we're trying to do to build this out, they'll never understand or appreciate the work that is trying to be done to make sure to benefit them just as much as they want to make sure that we're trying to do things to be held accountable for them. A great example.
Well said, well said. We are really over time, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give everyone a last phrase or sentence to end the session, and then we can say goodbye to our guests. Dr. Bond,
I just had one, that's such an interesting question. Our diversity is not what's holding us back. I think your question was, maybe we're not higher on the SDG Global Index because we're a diverse country. You know, that's necessarily not the case. We are the richest country in the world. We have the highest pandemic deaths and infections. So our progress, didn't necessarily inoculate us. If you look at other countries, and we're not developing along as, I think that's what you were referring to, the question is, how do we get here? We have to look at the policies and practices that actually brought us here. And discrimination, xenophobia, and a lot of that has a lot to do with that. Redlining of communities. You got in this community and other communities, you've got white flight that take the resources to their suburban areas. But that's a good question, and I think that's something that we can certainly study, but there's, but it's not our diversity that's holding us back. It's how we're responding to the needs of a diverse population, poor people and others. I say for a policy practice, if you attend to the least of us, leave no one behind, then you'll attend to the rest of us.
What I was trying to say is that our diversity is something that poses challenges because of the way we've responded to it historically, and that's something other countries don't face. So I'm just saying it's harder for us, I would think, to meet some of those goals.
Yeah, and that's a really good discussion. But I'll say in other countries, they have their own challenges. There are tribal affiliations. I was just brought here last night from the airport by a Somali taxi cab driver talking about the issues in Somalia with poor governance. So the countries have their unique challenges, and we have our unique challenges. And you're absolutely right. I won't say the history of racism and discrimination. I'll say the ongoing practice of that. When you look at the work of In the Red and you see minority vulnerable populations, a map of literally everyone in the red, no peace, no justice, no food, no water, and the continuing practices, until we undo that, and take a policy approach to that, and a political approach, our politics is part of the problem, we're not going to sustainably develop as a nation when huge parts of the country are being left behind. And when people don't even want to have a conversation about it. But that's a really important question. I appreciate you asking it. Take that as my wrap up.
All right, well, we need to have SDGs 2. So I'm going to take the prerogative of closing this out because you've been a terrific audience and you stayed 20 to 30 minutes beyond the time, and I don't want to take more of that time, but know that we deeply appreciate your time and attention to this. So thank our panel. They'll be around a little bit, and onwards and upwards. Thank you.